Thank you for coming. Celebrate the publication of a new book by Charles Stein called Placing Space, Picturing Time, published by Jim Fleming's Autonomedia. And the book came about out of a desire that Terry had and I had to have a responsive viewer visit the studio on a regular basis without any purpose except to look at paintings and think about them and eventually write and respond to them. And those of you who are students here know a bit about Charles Stein. He's a poet. He did his PhD on Charles Olson's work. He's a classicist. He's a mathematician. He's written several books and co-authored several books on mathematics. He's familiar with linguistic theory, with astrophysics, with an extraordinary range. I mean, you really are extremely lucky to have someone like this who you can avail yourself of, and I hope you do. He's a remarkable individual. So I just brought him by, picked him up and brought him by Terry's studio in upstate New York in Ancrumdale, and he looked at pictures, responded to them, and so you have someone who is dealing with a quality of beauty that is very unusual, that's very atypical, that satisfies and challenges us on a lot of different levels, including chemical and biological and psychological, and also an artist who has shown that paintings can be powered by extremely powerful ideas, that a painting can be a receptacle for very powerful ideas. And that's what this book is about. And on that note, I'll turn it over to Terry. You'll show a few images to start things off. How are we going to start?
This book has two sections. One was the text of a catalog, a piece that I wrote for Terry's show in Cologne a few years ago, and then an extension of that. So what we thought we would do before getting into the more conversation aspect of it would be to show some of the paintings that, basically that's what you have, right?
Basically that is what I have.
The paintings that were in that show, that's the first part of the book, and then a second show in New York that the rest of the book also encompasses. So I think that's what we do first.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, because I want to thank Raymond for getting Chuck and me together, and to thank Chuck for focusing so much of his attention on my work. Chuck said so much, and I have so little to say that basically I have nothing to say. Which John Cage famously said that I have nothing to say, and that is poetry, and I have nothing to say, and it's a PowerPoint.
Well, he also said I have nothing to say, and I am saying it.
Yeah, and he is saying it, but I'm not even saying it. I'm just going to show this PowerPoint, and so I brought pictures, as Chuck said, of paintings. But really, all the paintings that were in the exhibitions that Chuck really dealt with over the course of his visits to my studio. There were two exhibitions, one in Cologne and one in New York. So this is a picture of the Bohm Chapel when it was first built in the early 50s in Cologne, Germany. It was a Catholic church, really. I knew nothing about the Bohm Chapel. But I did have an ongoing interest and relationship with German expressionist architecture. So this is, on the top is an image of a Bruno Taut crystal palace, and on the bottom is a Frei Otto structure in Cologne. Both of these structures are in Cologne, and they were the Frei Otto structure was he was the head of the Lightweight Structures Institute, and it was basically a kind of concert or lecture hall that was done out in a park structure. So I have a big interest in that, in the kind of experimental geometric architectural approach that so much modernist German architecture was focused on. And also a big interest in German expressionist film and the stage sets that they produced. On the left is a poster for the Golem, and on the lower right is the Hans Pohlig sets that he designed. Pohlig was a very distinguished German architect who also did these film sets for the Golem. And on the upper right is the cabinet of Dr. Kilgary, which was done by Hermann Warm. And this is a picture of the chapel now. As I said, that I didn't know about Boehm's work really, and I didn't do these paintings for the chapel per se. I had an exhibition schedule that Raymond was helping to organize in Cologne at Rafael Yablonka's gallery, and when they came to the studio, they saw a very direct correspondence between the imagery that I was developing in the paintings and the kinds of images that were really implied and embodied in the chapel itself. This is part of the renovation that Yablonka had done. I mean, he completely renovated the chapel, reinstalled a bell tower, and had new bells cast for the church. This is an interior view. I can actually point with my finger to the slides. These are one view across the chapel of 3 paintings, and this is another painting called Area that was also in the show. There are 5 paintings in this exhibition. And again, they were not, I guess I was very far along in the project of working on these paintings when we decided to show them here. So there was some way that the pictures became informed by the chapel, but they were never intended to be a response to the chapel. And I think I would have made a very different group of paintings if that's what they were. So they're really a continuation of a kind of investigation that I was involved with over a number of years, and sort of became manifest as this exhibition through a series of coincidences and circumstances. These are 3 paintings that were on that back far wall that I just showed a picture of the installation. Just so you all have a reference of what the kinds of things we're talking about. So those were the 5 paintings that were in the show. This is where I painted the paintings. I mean, I think there's so much about the work and my own involvement in architecture that these pictures are a product of, a kind of architecture, a kind of temporal architecture that gets developed in the painting and is also somehow manifest through the presence in the buildings they're shown in and the buildings they're made in. So this is
underline that phrase, temporal architecture.
Temporal architecture. So this is my studio up in the country that Chuck came to visit, and I painted these paintings, which is one of the first groups of pictures that I finished in the studio there. This is another painting not in the exhibition but that came directly after the picture, which is called, it's called Cricket Music. It was really a kind of response to painting in that studio with the kinds of fractured sounds that I was really surrounded by. And the title itself refers to a Walter Di Maria musical piece that was written in 1964, which called Cricket Music, which was Di Maria playing drums along to a recording of cricket sounds. And I had been involved with Walter's work for some time, and actually was worked with him on the installation of the lightning field in the late 70s when I first got out of art school. And in some sense, I think my move to the country and all of the kind of surrounding environmental concerns that came out of that are a direct extension or reflection of that time I spent with Walter out in New Mexico. This is a large picture that was in the show that I had done after the Cologne exhibition in New York at Matthew Mark's gallery. It's called a Tessellation Figure. And a whole group of paintings came out of this one particular picture. This painting is about 8 foot by 10 foot, so we are looking at a very distorted view. This is an installation view at the Matthew Mark's gallery with a painting. So there were a series of 12 paintings that in a sense were a kind of extrusion out of the kind of geometric imagery that I was engaged with at the time and first developed through the Cologne pictures. And how those really structural geometric configurations could somehow build into a more pictorial realm with a kind of illusionistic atmospheric space that would develop through the painting process. And to begin to see painting itself as a visualization system within which to realize these pictures that I couldn't quite have anticipated. all of these paintings are, I guess, about 7 foot high. And I'm just showing all the pictures that were in Cologne and all the pictures that were in New York, and the kind of range from one to the next, and the way that each one both anticipated or was a non sequitur to the next one. I was trying to build a range of imagery that both extended, reflected, and denied the kind of exploration that was happening in each painting. And to build a kind of chromatic range across the group that began to open up the potentials of color that could be unleashed from the graphic language that I was developing my drawings. I was almost exclusively working with pencil and ink drawings, and working in black and white over the past 5 or 6 years. And I wanted to see how moving to painting with a change of scale and a change of material and the change of color could affect the kind of psychological and emotional implications of the imagery I was developing. That's another installation view of the Matthew Mark show, and this was the first painting that one saw in entering the gallery, and it was the last painting I completed from the group of 12 paintings. And that's the building that I showed them in on 22nd Street over here, just a few blocks from here in New York.
Our conversation actually began at Terry's studio around the question of what did it mean to have these geometrical, they're not just geometrical spaces, but spaces as such, as depicted as in a pictorial language. In other words, the question became, what happens to the issue of space in an abstract or quasi-abstract canvas that on the one hand has a pictorial feel, whatever pictorial means, but has as the thing that it's picturing a space. What's now the relationship between the familiar sense from 100 years, 150 years of modern painting, of the organization of colors and forms and shapes and lines and textures and whatnot within some kind of a rectangular field, and the space as the organization of those forms, whether those forms are purely abstract forms that are tending towards pure geometry or completely tactile, clumpy senses of paint hanging on canvas, that you have a relationship between the forms that you see and that space. What happens to that relationship when you have an image that is clearly an image of a space? And so they all have grid-like spaces, but they are not Euclidean grids. They're not Mondrian grids. They're not grids that have as their reference the plane geometry of a two-dimensional surface where the metrical relationships are homogeneous throughout the space, but rather the spaces themselves seem to be modern geometrical spaces where the spaces are warped, or that the spaces have a kind of life of their own. And not only that there seem to be, if you look closely, maybe more than one of them, and that the spaces themselves are in interaction. So now you have a relationship between materiality of the formal images given by paint, line, and so forth, and the shape of the canvas, and the abstract space itself, which is made pictorial. That is to say, you have a picture of a space. And so we kept talking about this question of, because in not just these works, but in much of Terry's earlier works, there are images that derive from scientific or mathematical concepts, contexts. So there's a whole series of works that have to do with set theory. There are works that deal with different kinds of knot forms. So these are aspects of our sense of the modern world, really, if one's familiar with the mathematical thought even a little bit, the idea that there are non-Euclidean geometries and that these have something to do with our picture of the physical world. and these images that come from mathematics and from different fields of science that appeal to the eye. What's the relationship to the actual activity of painting? And so I started spinning out all kinds of notions about what that might mean, and we talked quite a bit about it. And so what's in the first part of the text is something like a speculation on what a kind of contribution to human consciousness a painter's relationship to these rather abstract and arcane objects are when they're allowed to appear in imaginative form in a pictorial language and set up a kind of dramaturgy in which spaces themselves are in interaction with each other, but also in relationship to the painter's imagination and the process of allowing forms to emerge through them. You have to nod now.
Okay. Sounds good.
So that's the whole first part of that book is around this question of spacing space. Talking fast while drinking water. Something like an answer arrives at the end of that section in my text, in which the question is, what is the space in which the relationship between paint and canvas, form and geometry are set into a complex double polarity of interactions? What is the space that you're looking at? These are big paintings. They sit on big walls. They have almost monumental quality, so that as you are standing in front of them, your relationship to your space and the space that the painting is in, that is manipulating space, becomes very, very dynamic. And so something like the answer is the space of the painting finally is your space. That there's a continuity between the pictoriality of the images of space and your space, a kind of continuity that develops, that is speaking to the traditional problem of representation, the representation of space throughout Western painting, but is really quite different, because the spaces that are represented are no longer the spaces that look outside of a Renaissance window into a perspectival illusionism, but are something that are created by very different geometrical means. So I kind of develop it up to the point where you can sort of say the space is your space. Then with the rest of these paintings, this one is in the second exhibition at the Cologne show. I became interested in the things that Terry was mentioning when he was talking a while ago about the relationship from one painting to the next, but also something like the temporality of an architecture. What architectural temporality or temporal architecture, what could that be? And I tried to reverse the common sense that there are temporal arts and non-temporal arts, and that the temporal arts would be music and poetry and theater and drama and so forth, and the non-temporal arts would be photography and painting and sculpture. Try to reverse that by saying that what we normally think of as temporal arts are actually arts in which the temporality of the artist is imposed upon the temporality of the viewer. You enter into the time of the movie, you enter into the time of the music, you enter into the time of the poetry, and where those arts try to do something else in the late modern period, maybe John Cage's music, where you remain in a kind of natural time. There's the imposition of time is something different. Those are exceptional. But when you're looking at a painting, or particularly a painting, the temporality is that something has been placed in your time, but there is a vivid and important sense of time that actually enters into the process of viewing it. And with these paintings, as you actually stand in front of them, one dimension of the temporality of it, for me, has been You watch it for a while. I mean, here I say, you watch it. Like you don't normally say you watch a painting. But that's sort of my experience. You watch the painting for a while and you come to a sense of it. And you perhaps articulate to yourself what it is what you're watching. And as soon as you've performed that articulation, it starts to change. You start seeing something else. And so you follow it and you watch it some more. And the articulation now goes a little further, and now you see something else. And so there's a kind of internal dramaturgy for the dialectic that you perform on yourself as you follow it. I'm not saying that what you see is extremely articulated, but something like that was happening with me. So I was involved with this question of the drama of the different geometries, and then I notice I haven't been noticing the color or responding to the intensity of the color or the relationship to the color or the affect of the color, or the fact that there are quasi-figures that are sitting there among the tessellations, the tiles, or as one moves forward and back in relationship to the surface of the painting. That, I mean, we don't know, but if you blew up any of those little tiles, you'll see that there's a painting inside each one of them. That each one of them is a painterly composition, and it's a painterly composition in which all kinds of issues of the relationship between the materiality of the paint, its transparency, its viscosity, the way in which it seems to be gripping or hanging onto the canvas is playing in relationship to the internal shapes, so that you become involved in what I guess it was Jasper Johns talked about, the almost sculptural quality of a certain kind of painting that was happening in the 60s and action painting period, that the molding of the paint within the shapes has its own life, but it's very much a matter of actual distance, that you move away a certain distance and all of that material sort of folds back up into the tiles that are held within the larger space. So the questions about what the meaning of that materiality is in relationship to a kind of time started to I became involved in that the time of the paint's adherence to the canvas has a kind of peculiar temporality. Actually, during the time I was writing this, I should tell this story. I was also working with writing about another painter, Francesco Clementi, and he had painted these paintings on glass, and I wrote these pieces about the paintings. Well, he was experimenting with painting on something where the viscosity or the hold of the paint on the glass was very, very problematic. And by the paintings arrived in where was it? It was in
Trento.
In Trento. The paint had peeled off the glass, and he had to repaint the whole damn paintings in order to actually carry on the show. So the question of there being a hidden temporality of the actual viscosity of the paint in relationship to the canvas is something that you don't quite see, and yet in a certain way it affects what you do see. There is the paint is holding onto the canvas, and these shapes and feelings of what's going on in there brings you up to the very edge of the materiality of the medium. But the materiality, in a sense that it's not like you have written underneath paint on canvas and you're supposed to see it as the painting as a reading of what an example of that particular medium. It's more like the mystery of what the materiality really is pushed right in front of you. There it is. It's happening in your space, but also in your time. And part of the dimension of that time is how long is that paint going to hang on to that canvas? Is it going to fall off before the exhibition? Is it going to last 500 years without changing colors? Is it going to last?
It's stable on the slides.
It's really cool on the styles, but how long is, we may not have electricity in 5 years. we'll lose the electronic grid. Nobody has any guarantee for such matters. So in other words, that there are many different elements to the temporality of the character of the painting, some of which has to do with the relationship of the paintings among each other, the order with which you experience the different dimensions, not just the geometrical dimensions, but just the sense of the different kind of issues that occur to you are present in the painting, and that create a kind of symphonic accumulation, all the way down to the peculiar temporality of the materials themselves. So that goes. The whole second part deals a lot with those kind of time questions. You have to smile, nod, say hello, say no. This is really
good.
dumb. I'm sorry.
Good. No, it all sounds good, and I appreciate everything Charles has brought to looking at my paintings. And it really comes down to, I think, sort of what Frank Stella said a long time ago. There are two things in paintings: what is a painting, and how do you make a painting? And I think that I spent a number of years trying to figure out what that meant to me. Like, what would it mean to set up parameters within which I could give myself permission to make paintings that I thought had a kind of resonance or traction within contemporary life, and addressed a number of issues that I felt were not just academic, but that were critical and almost ontological in terms of what modernist painting offered. And so it's sort of within that, trying to make something that was kind of entertaining and exciting. And that's sort of the whole enterprise, basically.
Okay, underline that word, ontological, spoken by anybody with some embarrassment.
I'm embarrassed.
Except by me, as my students know very well. I don't get embarrassed by talking about ontology.
No, but that's what I appreciate about reading, having a chance to read Chuck's text around my work. The idea that painting can still address these kinds of issues and have this kind of engagement with things that have a kind of trajectory and meaning that are beyond kind of media and commodity is something that's kind of exciting. And it's something that only the marginalized arts can really deal with and address. And I think that since we're embodied in a culture that we're surrounded by so many other kinds of messages, it's challenging to try to navigate through to say something that's different or alternative to it.
Now you're supposed to nod.
Yeah, I know.
Drawing is very central to what I do, and it's the approach I take to everything, really. And it's the aperture through which I approach either making prints or making paintings. And it's an attitude and a relationship to mark making and to a very immediate and intuitive response to materials and the circumstances around which these marks get made. So each instance is a unique and autonomous event in itself, however related. So there are a number of related drawings to these paintings, but there's nothing, it's not so much as a working drawing. Yeah. The argument or the text that Chuck is developing deals with ideas about mathematics as an organizing principle within which we try to find some kind of emotional space or some idea about locating being or what all of this might be itself. And I think that was so much the program for abstract painting from its very inception. And I think that there's a way that it's still ultimately the most engaging aspect of what it can be. So I think its relationship to mathematics doesn't imply that it deals with the same kind of functional, predictable events. I mean, in fact, it throws it into a kind of chaotic situation out of which hopefully some other kind of emotional or psychological imagery or
Well, that
awareness
was
can come.
the idea of our calling it emergent pictoriality, the ontological questions, which are the question of, given that all these things are in play, what sense of reality, what sense of being can emerge, and that my axe to grind in a certain way is that these processes of paintings that Terry exemplifies so, to me amazingly, remain a site in which the human relationship to the great questions of what is real actually can have an originary position. It's not like the work is an illustration of a mathematical or a physical or any other kind of theoretical posit about the nature of reality. It's that our historical and actual condition is that all of these notions are in play, and there are no real authorities that actually can tell you how they're to be disposed. And the artist still is in a position in which an originary sense of being can emerge. And with that, the whole question of value comes into play. That after all, what actually is going on in the creation of a painting like this is that an object that's going to be presented for someone to see, whether it's even just the artist himself, is something that has been in some way imbued with value, and imbued with a value that's original to the event. It's not like the value exists somewhere else and the painting exists as an illustration of that value. It's that the search for the allowance of an emerging picture that has relevance to the sense of the question of what is reality also has relationship to the sense of what is value. That the values are being invented, the values are emergent at the same time as the sense of what's being depicted is emergent. And then that's delivered over into the time of the viewer. So there's a kind of transactionality that the whole life of the thing involves a real hazard. And the hazard is, I am putting this thing that I feel as valuable on display. Do you see it too? Or, and it becomes like that great line of Frank Zappa years ago, do you like it, do you hate it? There it is, the way you made it. You're in the hazard of the actual creation of value. And that remains, to me, a value in spite of everything. So, that's the part of the pitch of the book, really, is I don't think I go beyond that.
And it's great to hear Chuck engage ideas about painting in this way, and the fact that it's somehow reflected on my own painting is just a bonus. So that's wonderful. But I think that all of these kinds of issues that he's talking about really come back to Nancy Princenthal is here, and she's going to speak another day here about Agnes Martin, who laid out also another kind of landscape about what paintings can mean and what they can be, and the challenge is how one creates novelty within that tradition at the same time respecting and trying to emulate those achievements. And that's sort of the job description for painting, and it's always been the job description. However much the greater culture changes and alters and offers other kinds of alternatives.
There's another little theme, which is that if, I sort of propose, if this is a kind of recrudescence of action painting, we really need to look again more closely at what an action is. And so there's a whole attempt to sort of revive the ontological interest in the question of what that action is, rather than reducing it to the kind of cartoon version of the hand of the artist and the various different discussions that sort of dominated criticism towards the end of the period of the action painters, and then tends today still to be somewhat dismissed. So there's an attempt to recover an interest in the question of what an action is, and how the act of imbuing an object with value might be of some pertinence.
Harry, all of the ideas that Chuck is talking about are actually ideas that in interviews through the years you've discussed as well. I'm wondering, who are some of the theorists or thinkers when you were starting out in painting that really gave momentum to your work?
This is stump the panel. It's more about the painting, that the paintings come out of painting and it comes out of the ideas of painting. But I think there's so much of what Chuck was just saying about the kind of rhetoric around abstract expressionism and how I saw that as being a possibility that opened up to avenues of exploration that extended beyond the notion of self-expression, and that the ideas of action had implications about how objects are made. And sort of out of that, I mean, I think, in some sense, I mean, Picasso and Johns are sort of the two greatest theorists of painting, and I think that there's a way that there's so much out of that I've tried to build out of. I mean, there's a whole litany of people, a line of people who've I've worked out of, try to work out of.
At a certain point, and I don't know who it was a discussion, I guess it was with you, right? Where we talked about photography as being information poor. Did we talk about that?
Yeah, but we might have disagreed about it.
Oh, well. Did we really? What were we saying? I don't remember.
Well,
somebody said that in this stable of Raymond Foy. Anyway, the notion was. There's a little section that deals with this in a kind of abbreviated way. It's sort of a kind of quick picture of the relationship of photography to painting, beginning with the advent of photography in the mid-19th century, that the verisimilitudinous role of the photograph eclipses the verisimilitudinous role of painting, so that painting becomes somewhat liberated from the human desire to have representations of the visual world, that photography starts to fulfill that role. And so my question in relationship to that becomes, what exactly is it about photography that makes it have this idea that it becomes almost the icon for the idea of a true representation? How come a photograph seems real? I mean, the damn thing about a photograph is visual perception is more or less continuous. A photograph is a slice. It represents a tiny. It's not the old cameras. You know, remember when, in my childhood, the cameras, popular cameras had two settings. One was called time, and the other was called instantaneous. And you could set the Brownie, the little box camera, at instantaneous, which would be actually maybe a 30th of a second, a 50th of a second, something like that. That was instantaneous. Or you could hold the thing down, and it would give you a time exposure that was as long as you liked. But clearly that instantaneous section of time is very unlike the way we perceive until you actually get into a subtler sense of what our, not so much the continuous stream of visual phenomena, but the cognitivity of the world. That is the way in which the visual phenomena interact with our sense of what's going on. And as soon as you think about that for a little bit, you realize that for the most part, what you do in, say, walking on the street of New York is you take in just as much of the visual world as you need to negotiate your relationship to your next step. In other words, you say, okay, that's a person, that's a dog, better get out of the way, the dog's gonna shit. Now I'm at the edge of the street, the car is coming, the light now says bicycle. What does that mean? New lights on the street lights, and so forth. And there's this kind of internal narrative, which is reading the momentary visual experience quite as if you were taking in just enough information to make a snapshot of it. And it's my argument is that photography, in the ordinary sense, and this is not, we're not talking about Stieglitz or Steichen or Cartier-Bresson. We're talking about your camera phone and the instantaneous representation of moments of existence that you could flash up on Facebook. But before that, snapshots and the images that are used to represent news events or advertising, that these are, it's as if our cognitive life were photographic already. That is, consciousness is itself already photographic. And the verisimilitudinous pretension of photography is that it corresponds exactly to that cognitivity. just enough information to tell you what something is, that you get that the photograph and cognition gives you that very practical negotiation of visual space to give you the what something is that you need in order to get to the next moment with it. So contrast that to the situation of painting, in which, again, you have a surface, but the surface is not a receptacle of a single instant. It's a receptacle of thousands of instants. And the accumulation of a very, very elaborated, deliberative time on a surface, which is then delivered over to you, is very, very different from the photographic situation. And that really was true about good painting all along. That is, you had as a kind of function to give representations that were what became photograph-like, but cognitive-like. But think about portraiture in the heyday of 17th century, 18th century portraiture, how the portrait is a very strange accumulation of experiences of the presence of a human being that's registered through the complex activity that is the painting. It's not like a momentary cognition of the presence of a person at all. And certainly historical painting and landscape painting are very complex in that relationship too. So, I mean,
I showed a couple of years ago a group of collages that as a kind of workbook of source materials, and they were really built in the same way that I build the paintings, as a layering or a lamination of information. And I think that the paintings are accumulated in the same way. I think the paintings have been more unwilling to settle into a situation where they can be easily identified or named. But I think that is a very loose and open-ended field, and I think that it can move into that for me too. And I think that the notions of abstraction and representation is such now that painting can open up just all the questions about it, where the differences between them have completely dissolved, and painting can address ideas and issues about information in a new way that are unique to painting itself, in the same way that it did in some way confront all of the problems and propositions that photography provided in the 19th century, and the way that film did in the early 20th century. So I think that a lot of the imagery that came out of the collages were actually kind of digital in origin, and I'm trying to find some way to manage and to digest the digital information to be part of what the painting process becomes.
I mean, I do a lot of photography, and I'm sort of interested in this question a lot about how you actually can arrange a moment to photograph so that the complexity of an expressive moment can actually be registered there. I wouldn't deny that. It's just a simple observation, really, that the moments of projection onto the if you're making a photograph, it still has to happen in a relatively instantaneous situation. Of course, if you're taking into account photoshopping and elaborating a photograph with all the technological material that's available today, then there would be hardly any difference at all. But in the ordinary sense of a snapshot, it's very rare that you're able to actually find the angle and the moment to allow a very rich an informationally rich source to project itself in such a way that the photograph will hold that, because in fact it's the registration of a minute interval. It's an interval of whatever the shutter speed actually would be. So yeah, of course you can do that. I sort of prefaced this by saying I'm not talking about Cartier-Bresson or Steichen, and I meant by that anybody who would be allowing the photographic moment to register a rich source. But still, I think there's a kind of simple observation there that the difference between the instantaneous registration of a moment and a canvas whose temporality is very different in terms of what is received. It's receiving, like with Terry, we didn't talk about this, but part of what he does is he creates these things that he calls the pre-presentational realm, which would be like laying in a geometrical structure. A few times when I saw his at the studio, what you would see would be these big canvases with some monochromatic grid laid in, and then, you know, after a period of time, every one of those boxes has been filled in with something, and another grid is working in relationship to it, and there are vast numbers of different moments that have been registered at very different levels, at the level in which a new decision is made to deal with something globally that's going to interact with what's happened so far, the way in which the particular development of a particular tessellation influences the way the ones around it actually are going to occur. And those have a very complex temporal order that at a simple level is clearly there. That's all.
Well, it's an accumulation of instants. So I kind of agree with you about the photography notion that the people who really can.
Yeah, but I just
back to Raymond's question, I mean, I think de Kooning is really the great philosopher of painting, and in some sense, you know, content is a glimpse, and that's all that any of us really have is an opportunity to see a glimpse of something, and that all of the working process is some attempt to move down the road and open up what he called a likeness, that even abstract shapes must have a likeness. And it's sort of that likeness that resonates with both, I think, hopefully, I mean, for me, that's the buzz, like getting that likeness through the process of making the paintings, and hopefully what someone who might view the paintings would get, some connection and some sense that there's something that's being recognized through the process of having made the painting. And it's less of a representation than a feeling of connection, I think, with what the image might be. The whole project, the whole purpose of making paintings is to get beyond yourself and to get beyond those sort of set limits that one has and to confront the kind of one's own comfort zone of knowledge in order to open up to things that are less explored and less known. So I think that that's the struggle, and that's the quality I look for in paintings that I feel engaged with. I mean, not just my own, but other people's paintings, where I see a kind of openness to some new territory that I've just never seen before, and is beyond even the limits and the expectations of the person who painted it. So I think that that's the goal. That's the job description.
As a spectator in this exploration of this space that you were describing at the beginning, and it seems to me that it would be impossible to achieve such exploration by focusing on details or areas of the painting. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the necessity of considering the painting as a whole, from the center to the edges, which can be a very difficult thing to do, just from the eye.
You know, the really interesting thing is that, of course, the ordinary way of trying to understand a painting is you work back and forth between detail and an overall sense, and you experience different kinds of gestalts and different kinds of ways of relationship to it, and you're working in relationship to the whole, and then. But at a certain point, I think in Terry's paintings, there's a kind of breaking down of the easy harmony between between the overall and the detail, and the time has something to do with that. I mean, there's almost a sense in which I want to say it's impossible to see the whole painting, because as soon as you see it, it changes. And I haven't looked at them, lived with them, or had one on the wall for 5 years or something, so I could say, nope, I'm not going to see anything new here. But my continuous experience with them is that I get you get exactly a sense of the whole, and precisely because I think I have a sense of it, suddenly there's a whole other thing I didn't see that starts coming into view, And I want to think of that as a temporal dimension of it, that it's at a cognitive level it's temporal. You see what I'm saying? That, you know, the ordinary way is that you want to see the composition. And the composition will tell you, well, there's this kind of balance, and this works here, and this is this moved away from balance and in this particular way, and there's this symmetry and this lack of symmetry and all of that, and it all comes together in this a kind of discursive whole that you can see. But with Terry's paintings, the dislocation of that seems to be very deep, so that you actually move through order and disorder and back to order and further inquiry somewhat endlessly. At least, you know, at the time you're going to see in a gallery or in a museum, you're not going to get to the end of it.
You know, we're surrounded by so much imagery that is disconnected from, like, that's incorporeal and disconnected from bodily and material experience. And I think that that's one of the great exciting aspects of painting right now, is that it offers a possibility to reanimate and re-embody information in a way that enriches a kind of psychological and emotional engagement.